I'm Tina Fordham, and you're watching a special mid-year edition of the Navigator. Today we're going to look at the political signposts and the shocks that could move markets and impact the business environment in the second half of 2024. So far this year, the geopolitical risks keep coming. We've talked before about my new geopolitical risk supercycle thesis and why our analysis suggests that we are entering a decade of dislocation, marked by more trade disputes, the continuation of conflicts, and a spike in great power competition. This year also features more countries going to the polls to vote than ever before, and that means more potential for changes, not only in government and key personnel, but also shifts in policy and regulation. My term to capture this is Vox Populi risk, and we've got a lot more of that to come in the second half of this year. If elections are orderly and the loser accepts the result, we call that a successful democratic transition. But if election outcomes are disputed, triggering civil unrest or worse, the political risk temperature increases. The key condition for democracy is this: the loser must accept the result. Markets are currently very concerned about populism, so let's define that term. Populism refers to a range of political positions, but at the core, there is an effort to differentiate between so-called elites, who are usually defined as corrupt and self-serving, and the people. One feature of populism can be that its leaders often propose overly simplistic solutions to complex challenges and usually appeal to emotions. The attraction can be very powerful in an environment as complex as the one we find ourselves in today, hence the growing success of populist parties, as we saw most recently in the European parliamentary elections. But to be clear, market participants tend to worry more about left-wing populism, with the expected increase in public debt assumed. The irony is that it is increasingly difficult to differentiate between the two, as protectionism, government intervention in the economy, rising debt burdens are all now fairly mainstream features of the political landscape in both developed and developing countries. In short, the labels of left and right don't mean that much anymore, even if the attempt to code political parties in this way continues. Now that's a very good segue to our top political risk for June and July, the snap elections that have been called in France, part of the fallout of the European parliamentary elections. French President Macron called a surprise legislative election after his centrist party government suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the far-right RN party. He's essentially dared French voters to decide whether they want to send a message of protest or be governed by this party. The shock has thrown Brussels and the French political establishment into disarray, and with good cause. One economic institute projection suggested that if enacted, the RN agenda would increase the size of the French deficit by 3.9%, and that's twice as much, roughly, as the Liz Truss mini-budget disaster that rocked markets. So, markets and Brussels will be very focused on what happens during the two-round French elections, June 30th and July 7th. To make a long story short, we are seeing a return to levels of EU political risk not witnessed since 2011, before Mario Draghi uttered those famous words, "whatever it takes." In between the two rounds of French legislative elections, the UK will go to the polls on July 4th. However, the re-election prospects for the Conservative Party government are looking dire. After 14 years in office, polls suggest that the opposition Labour Party has a staggering 20-point lead. To make matters worse for Rishi Sunak's government, the political right in the UK has been fragmented further with the emergence of the Reform Party under Nigel Farage, the former Brexiteer. Nevertheless, I don't expect financial markets to react especially badly to a Labour Party victory, even if Britain seems to be swimming against the European tide by likely voting for a centre-left government. That's because the policy differences between the two are simply not very dramatic. From a security and defence policy perspective, a Labour government will maintain continuity with the UK position on military support for Ukraine, for example. And although the Labour Party manifesto states a commitment to making a success of Brexit, there is a hope in the UK business establishment that relations between London and Brussels may finally start to thaw, and that would potentially benefit the City of London and the UK economy as a whole. Now, a final point about US elections, just a little more than 5 months away. You've heard me caution that polls are not a very useful guide until September or October, quite simply because most Americans aren't thinking much about the election yet. That hasn't stopped people from drawing their own early conclusions, with a growing consensus view in markets emerging of an impending Trump victory. You can see this base case appearing in a lot of sell-side research, and I certainly hear it in my conversations with investors who often cite prediction markets as evidence. The trouble with this is that prediction markets have a terrible record on predicting elections. Looking here at recent polling taken after Trump's felony convictions, we can see a very slight shift in support, with Biden now ahead by 1 point, statistically insignificant. It is just too early to make a call. That's all for this episode. Feel free to get in touch directly with your questions, and thanks for watching The Navigator.